All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm back with Larry McGrath. He's a researcher at Facebook and has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in history and anthropology of science, which is something new for the show. So, Larry, thanks for joining me today. Look forward to talking with you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Matt.
Great. So, Larry, would you mind? I gave a very brief introduction there, but I really like to hear everybody's story from themselves. So, would you maybe tell us all how what led you to anthropology, a little bit about the academic background, and then after that, we'll get into some of the more employment stuff.
Sure. Well, before I start on my origin story about how I came to anthropology, I should say that I'm here doing this podcast with you because I think that there is a real business need and value to be offered by the critical research skill set that anthropologists in particular, as well as humanists and social scientists generally, can bring to the business world. They can bring it to many worlds, but I work now in the business world, and that's what I'm prepared to talk with you today about. As for my beginnings, I decided to pursue a doctorate in the history of science from Johns Hopkins University back in 2008, because it was a time when there was massive interest and investment from both the Obama administration and the European Union in mapping the brain, to do to the brain what had been done to the human genome back in the 1990s. And so I set about writing a dissertation on the history of the brain sciences in Europe, particularly in France, because it was my conviction that for these projects to succeed, cultural context needed to be taken into account, that although we have the same organ between our ears called the brain, the way in which it's analyzed, understood, mapped is dependent on contingent contexts in different places in time. And so I went about writing a dissertation on the history of the brain sciences in France. People oftentimes ask me, why France? And there are multiple reasons. One of them converges with the work we do as anthropologists. There's a fundamental assumption that science, technology, life more generally is not the same everywhere, that cultural variance is part of what we're interested in understanding. And so there is no universal history of the brain sciences to be written. The second reason is that my skill set is in French. I lived there for a long time, and so that's the linguistic training that I have. And then the third is that there's so many parts of our brain that are named after old dead French people, as well as neurological disorders. Think of Tourette syndrome that was named after Gilles de la Tourette. And so the French were really pioneering in advancing the brain sciences and helping us understand the mind-brain problem. I spent some time in academia teaching the history and anthropology of science, and eventually published a book based on my research. You can find it at University of Chicago Press. It's titled Making Spirit Matter: Neurology, Psychology, and Selfhood in Modern France. But after time, I was no longer satisfied with the state of American academia. For a few personal and professional reasons, I was teaching at Wesleyan University at the time and had very clever students in my seminars, but I found myself wanting a few things. One was control over where I live. Second was some more money. Academics don't make a whole lot of that. And third was to be able to do research that had a more material impact beyond just contributing more articles to journals or chapters to anthologies that would be read by an elite, meaningful, but ultimately narrow audience. So I left. I did consulting in the medical world, working primarily with companies in biotech, doing research on neurodegenerative disorders. And so it was really meaningful to be able to spend time in hospitals and clinics doing anthropology for the sake of pharmaceutical and medical devices. And I ultimately transitioned to Facebook, where I now do cultural research and work with a research team investigating forms of value in ads and business across different cultures. Again, the assumption there being that Although plenty of us in the world are plugged into social media and use technology, the way in which we use it is not at all the same. And so understanding the role that cultural context plays can really bring about value for companies, for Facebook, for whom I work.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. And, I'll just to sort of build on that, I know you on LinkedIn, which maybe people should check you out, and we could talk about exactly where they can find you later, but you'd share a lot of interesting content that, I think would be relevant for everybody listening. And so what you said in there, there's a lot to dig into, and, I want to be maybe mindful of time, but your background, again, is a little bit different. And, I'm wondering, do you think that particular degree path provides you, and specific specific sort of value add maybe over some other degree paths?
I think there are a lot of degrees that offer entrees into the business world. Anthropology is a great one, since there's a premium right now on the observational knowledge of people in their local life worlds that can contribute to product design. When I studied the history of science, there was an anthropological component, spending time in hospitals and neurology clinics in order to understand how those sciences are actually practiced today. There was also an archival component, and that's a skill set that a historian brings, digging through materials that are not only published in journal or book form, but also unpublished in the form of letters, margin notes, library records, even material objects. And so I think that a historian who can work among such different media and collect such a wide array of data can contribute a lot to the analysis we do in the business world. Just the same, I think that people from the literature world, maybe even philosophy or religious studies, who are trained in amassing textual knowledge, interpreting it very closely, and then advancing arguments on the basis of that analysis, can offer a lot to the business world, because I think that the historical moment we live in right now, especially when it comes to tech companies, is that there is a surplus of numerical data, of big data that fills up the cells of spreadsheets, but that data can't explain itself, that we have a surfeit of data and therefore a renewed need for humanists and social scientists to bring that numerical data to bear on people's lives, to test it against real life experiences. In short, as we oftentimes put it, to bring thick data to complement the big data. And that's where I think multiple disciplines, including but not just anthropology, can contribute to the business world.
Great. And so you also said, you were teaching for a bit. You chose to move on from that environment for the reasons you mentioned. But did you always plan to teach? Was that the goal? Or did you always think that you might end up in business?
Business was a complete career 180 move for me. Since I was a high school student, I had constructed a picture of me as a professor. I think when I was a young, politicized activist, I wanted to be the next Noam Chomsky, who would use my position to, speak to America's interventions over the world. And it was a rather romantic picture that I had, but ultimately was one created in my youth. And when I fulfilled it in my 30s, I realized that it was no longer a picture that I desired as much as I once had. And so I took a big risk. It's a big risk moving on from a PhD because we're so habituated to certain institutions that validate our worth in the form of nuanced arguments, presenting them in front of seminars, conferences, workshops, and the business world was quite unknown. But I think the knowledge and skill set that a PhD has is incredibly useful in the business world. The difficulty is that it's a bit opaque as to how to make that skill set translate into a language understood by hiring managers, by teammates in the business world. I offer career transition consulting services on my website, Larry S. McGrath. I know you do similarly, and I think that there are great resources out there, both free and paid, for PhDs to jump into the business world that help eliminate some of that risk that I dealt with.
Right. So, and we'll link to that, in the show notes for everybody who's listening. Tell me, when you were, you're consulting on that now, but obviously you had to go through it the first time. So what were some of the challenges that you faced making the transition, and did anybody help you along the way?
Great question. The challenge that I faced was knowing what's out there. When you're an academic looking for jobs, there's a finite number of job boards that list openings. You also have advisors who are skilled in helping you get those jobs and packaging your application materials. The business world and the jobs to enter it are so much more decentralized. So much more of it depends on non-meritocratic means, such as networking, such as just talking to people and figuring out what's out there. And so my method was to buy about 50 coffees for people the summer that I realized that I was sick and tired of academia, and just get a lay of the land. And really that's approaching it much like we would as researchers, doing my own literature review, seeing what the possibilities are, and then narrowing it down from there.
Yeah, that's great. And the coffees, you could also basically say, informational interviews, which is something we generally recommend to people. And so when you were doing that, were you already honed in on UX from your own literature review, if you will, or did UX also pop out in your coffee sessions?
I knew that I wanted to do research, and the challenge that I faced, like many transitioning academics face, is whether what they want to maintain a focus on their specialty or instead pitch their skill sets. Do you want to work with the content knowledge that you've developed or transform it into formal skills? And I still wanted to work in the world of the human sciences, neurology, psychology, and their cultural contexts. And I did that for some time in the consulting world. It's not easy for all academics to be able to find that seamless transition. Mm-hmm. I no longer work with neurology and psychology at Facebook so much. It's more traditional ethnographic research, understanding normal people in their living context and how they deal with technology. But I think that's a big question that a lot of academics have to face. I came to UX research only after realizing that there is an incredible demand for research out there. And perhaps this is something that you've spoken about, Matt, on your other podcast, but there is a sort of strange, I think, monopolization of research by UX right now. And it's worth listeners keeping in mind that UX research is one kind of research, and there are other forms of research that inform products, strategy, and other business functions that anthropologists and social scientists can offer.
Sure, and not just other research jobs, and I appreciate that probably many anthropologists want to be in research jobs, but there's also lots of other roles that we can contribute to that are very, very meaningful and very important in the business environment, such as strategy roles, as you pointed out. So you find, you end up first in a science, role. So you got to play on the content knowledge that you had and the research skills. what made you, and that's a nice place to be, obviously, but what made you then make the leap to Facebook where you're giving up some of the work in the sciences?
Yeah. Facebook does seek out former academics, and you get to work on a wide variety of interesting products. Although Facebook is, at the end of the day, an ads business, they generate a lot of research using the 3 billion people or so that they have as potential research participants. And so that was very attractive. There are also numerous investments of Facebook in health, in wearable devices that I think are really exciting, in virtual reality, that offer really thrilling opportunities for cutting edge research. And most of all, I get to work with a diverse array of psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, whose skill sets are immense and that I admire. And I think both professionally and personally, it's important to surround oneself with people you admire.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and it certainly sounds like a nice work environment, and maybe pointing out one of the benefits of a larger organization over maybe some smaller startups. Right? Oftentimes in the smaller startups, we're a small team or even a team of one, and so for anybody listening that might have a preference, one thing we recently talked about in a AAA webinar was sort of making sure you're finding the right fit for you, and not every research role, just because it's UX research or consumer behavior, whatever it may be, not every role is really the right fit. There's organizational concerns, there's a number of them, even geographic, as you mentioned earlier on. So I think that's a nice point. So, now let's maybe focus on the work at Facebook a little bit more. So I forget, did you start pre-COVID or did you transition?
I did start pre-COVID, though so much of my research has been in the remote work era.
Yeah, so I was wondering how much, let me back up and say in tech, we might not always get to do as much in context, truly in context. Sometimes we're doing it digitally. So what's your work look like on a sort of daily basis? Are you, and I'll say pre-COVID, because obviously we're doing everything virtual right now, but were you doing a lot of really true in context, in the home kind of studies or?
Yes, that's right. In the before times, it meant spending time in people's homes, going shopping with them, spending time in people's workplaces, hanging out in front of a mall, for example, and doing flyby recruiting, getting people to spend 5 minutes with me, hanging out, say, in front of a municipal building to get a different context and community of people involved in the study. All of these different life worlds, and it is far more challenging to capture that richness of context, the naturalness of behavior that an anthropology would typically find in people's worlds, in field work. And we try to recreate that using remote methods of interviews, focus groups. I love using diary studies. But ultimately, the richness of the field is only partial as we capture it through any of those remote media.
Yeah. And so how have you made that transition? It's one thing I haven't really talked about yet on the podcast, but what maybe have you learned from going fully virtual, and what are maybe some of the challenges and any tips for anybody that's listening that might themselves already be working in UX?
It's a really great question. I don't think there's any clear-cut answer. It's an ongoing project for me to build the rapport, to be able to tailor my questions and prompts, to be able to account for not just interview subjects' attitudes, but also their behaviors, which we as anthropologists are geared to observe. I mean, fundamental assumption, as everyone knows, of ethnographic research is that there is a gap between attitude and behavior, and it's so difficult to capture the latter via video conference like this. I mean, you only see from my chest up right now. You barely have a sense of context, and so it's really important, I've found, when doing remote work, to ask questions about that context. Where are you in the home? Is this where you work? Is this where you play? What is the last thing that you did here? Where in the home did you come from before being here, to get a sense of the transitions? I did work for Facebook in early COVID that I published as a Medium article, trying to understand how people use technology and social media to introduce structure into the home as an alternative to the external structures on which we normally rely. We usually would organize our day pre-COVID around commutes, lunches, gym visits. If you have kids, then daycare, maybe out, happy hours. These were the sort of pillars that would make for pivot points in our day. And now we find that it's all on our own resources to create that organization and fragment the day into chunks. Perhaps we transition from the table to the couch, from the big, serious laptop screen to the small, fun, playful mobile phone screen. And so this is one way in which I think remote research skills can capture some of that context and behavior that we would otherwise normally get by being physically present in the field.
Yeah, I like the pivot point concept. That's great. And I'm wondering, is there anything that you're actually finding to be a benefit from all of this? Do you have greater reach than you might have otherwise, and is that providing any benefit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a dual-edged sword. On the one hand, I found that recruiting works quite well right now, but that's symptomatic of all the awful things that have happened during COVID. For example, more people are being laid off, so they need the extra money and they'll do a Facebook study. It's less likely, for example, that we get drop-offs because people are at home. Well, that's because they aren't going out and doing other things. And so as a result of people's difficult situations, it is easier to get participants into research, into remote research sessions. But I wonder about the future of ethnographic research in the corporate world post-COVID, once we're all vaccinated. In the immediate term, I wonder, even when boundaries between countries open up and travel returns, who's going to be open to welcoming strangers into an intimate space? Mm-hmm. That's going to be difficult. I also wonder about it from a corporate finance perspective, that now that so many companies have been able to operate lean, saving money on travel, doing less field work, will they use COVID as a shock doctrine to make these conditions more permanent and say, look, we produce good research with remote tools. Why do we need to spend that money sending ethnographers out into the field? I really hope that's not the case, but it has been before with other crises like the 2008 financial downturn. The jury's still out to see how businesses react post-COVID.
Yeah, sure. And, besides that, even just coming back to the office, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Facebook has said that at least some larger portion will be able to work remotely. And so that's even also obviously a factor that's playing in, at least for you, but for many of us.
Right.
And on that point, how maybe might be interesting to hear, obviously Facebook has a pretty sizable research team. And so how has the dynamic changed as a team of researchers and your interactions, as a result of COVID, and how are you all kind of handling that? And maybe one question leading up to that, are you an embedded model or are you all centralized? Are you embedded in a specific product team or?
Sure. Look, COVID is a huge blow to team dynamics. There's so much more intention and coordination required now to meet as a team. There's so much less serendipity and water cooler chat, as it were. But that echoes the general world in which we live in. The COVID era is a time of coordination and planning. There's such little chance in our social encounters anymore. I live in New York City. I long for the times that my friends would call me late night on Friday and say, hey, I'm on the Lower East Side, and I tell them I'm on the Upper West Side, and we'll encounter at some point. Doesn't happen anymore. Everything is planned and reserved in advance, and that happens in a micro form at the office. When it comes to Facebook's model, our research division is enormous. I think it's about 550 people right now, and it's both embedded and not. Most product teams do have 1 to 3 researchers who do evaluative research. That is, they test the design of the product and make sure it's good to go live. I don't do that. I'm on a separate research team, what we call an ecosystem research team. In other businesses, it's sometimes called foundational or exploratory research. And the questions that I tackle are questions of value, especially non-monetary value. What value do people get out of privacy, for example? Facebook's undergone a immense initiative to craft better privacy products for people. And, it's, I think, a very important question, especially in a social media world where people value the concept of privacy, yet their actions are oftentimes out of sync with that, given that they want to share so much of their life online. So what value does privacy have for people is a question that that my team examines independently so that we can bring understanding and insights back to a variety of teams at Facebook.
Got it. So your work in particular, the more sort of generative work that you're doing is very ripe for the application of social theory and understanding of privacy as a social construct that really differs across, the 3 billion plus user base.
Yes.
And as opposed to some evaluative type work where, some relatively simple observation can really address sort of 80% of the problems without having to sort of couch it all in theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unlike some roles, you presumably get to really pull in a bit more from our toolkit. And so can you maybe speak a little bit about that? How does theory play in your work particularly, and how is that received within the organization?
Absolutely. I was trained in some of the rarefied bastions of social theory in America, first in the rhetoric department at University of California, Berkeley, where I was advised by Judith Butler, a gender theorist, and then at Johns Hopkins, which is a place where French post-structuralist theory had a enduring impact. It was the first American institution where Jacques Derrida presented, for example, back in the 1960s. And those theoretical toolkits have always been very important. They've informed the research that I've done in academia and in business. When it comes to business, it's up to us as people who have those skill sets to translate them into terms that are adapted to our audiences, because as we know, those critical tools are oftentimes written in a jargon that's a bit esoteric for others, and that's why I love them, of course, and I can speak theory to others. But what it's helped me appreciate, first and foremost, in my work with human participants, doing human research, is that humans are riven. we're torn through and through, that if you look at the bottom of what we are, you won't find identity, you won't find sameness, you find us pulled in multiple directions. That humans aren't just one thing. And I think that's very important when doing research and accounting for the different aspects of ourselves, the conflicts between attitudes and behaviors, the way we change over time, the way we segment social groups. That if you keep in mind that humans aren't one thing, then research results that show, for example, how people hate the idea of ads in general, yet actually quite like particular ads that they see, no longer appear as contradictions, but very normal aspects of our conflicted life. That coming to terms with what satisfies us personally and what we think is good socially, for example, there are disconnects all over the place. And accounting for these things is what my theoretical toolkit has helped with. And those are always research insights that I try to deliver to my teams and the wider Facebook organization, is to show how people are pulled in multiple directions and how we might better design products that account for the multifaceted nature of humans.
So that's no easy task. That's very different than a relatively small UI tweak just to, increase some kind of click-through rates. So how do you go about that difficult task of getting others to understand your insights? What has worked for you, given the complexity of the content, and almost like, it's something like value in and of itself, right? Value is something that is a construct that, can be defined many ways by many different people. I imagine when using that term frequently, even internally, there's just a lot of misunderstanding about maybe what you mean by it, unless you're making sure to really operationalize it well. So how, what do you do to overcome the kind of problems that you have in your particular type of space?
Sure. Most people interpret value as dollars, cents, shekels. Value is not always monetary, of course. What makes for a rich experience, what makes for user satisfaction, brings them value. It makes them recurrent users, and that ultimately impacts ROI, just not in an immediately monetary sense. One advantage of working at a large organization like Facebook is that the case for more experimental research doesn't need to be made as aggressively as it would be in a smaller organization with less resources. At Facebook, we can take on marginal research endeavors that might be peripheral to the company's focus, because we have the means to take risks and make mistakes. But when it comes to doing value research and communicating to others that humans are conflicted, as I mentioned before, and that we need to design products that account for our contradictory sides, I research what people are already doing, as we call it, researching for latent behaviors. How are people using our products in ways that we might not have already known about? Oftentimes, UX research is used in order to help refine products or identify new products. It's important, I think, to use UX research to understand why you might not want a new product at all, why the current one is perfectly good, and why adding new whistles and bells is just going to make the situation worse. In other words, there's a sort of quietist approach to some of my research to help allay product developers or marketers or engineers' fears that we need to add a new button, that we need to generate a new product, when in fact people are fully satisfied with what they're doing right now. They just use workarounds and behaviors that we don't have metrics for and weren't able to measure. And that's what an ethnographer can help reveal for the sake of others.
Yeah, great. And in your particular case, are you also, when you have an insight that you think needs maybe some product change, whether that's new product, addition to the product, whatever it may be, are you also making recommendations, or are you stopping at insights and turning that over to another team and then they're running with it?
My insights tend to be more strategic. Let's focus on, for example, increasing more seamless experiences instead of asking people for consent at every stop of the way, because that's going to annoy them. That's one example. So when it comes to designing specific products, no, my recommendations don't take that specific a form. They do, however, my recommendations, that is, oftentimes persuade people about opportunities to harmonize and eliminate products. When you work at a large organization, especially where research and product development can get siloed, teams work independently from one another without the coordination that's needed in order to generate a coherent experience. And so when it comes to Facebook, there's just so many tools available within the Facebook world that when you log in, identifying opportunities to harmonize them, to bring them together, potentially to eliminate some of them, I think is a meaningful output of UX research for helping create a more seamless experience for users.
Sure. Now, there's also another problem in there, which comes up quite a bit, which is not just harmonizing in the way you described it, but also really among researchers that are spread out across product teams, or in your case, in your own, in this sort of ecosystems world versus, those doing the evaluative research. And so, and if, I'm not sure if you can talk about this or not, this might be too specific to Facebook, but are you doing anything to make sure that all researchers understand the findings and the insights ultimately, and that, like any kind of systems in place to help for knowledge management, organizational memory, anything in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm in dialogue with researchers constantly. The risk of research at a large organization is always duplication. If you're just one of a few researchers at a large organization, you never encounter that risk. So much of what you do at a small company is done for the first time. This is where my historical training kicks in, and I think it's a worthwhile it's something worth keeping in mind, that as a historian, I tend to think that there's very little that's new in the world. My general assumption is that if you have a thought, if you've done something, it's probably been thought or done before. And so it's important to understand precedent. I know the word unprecedented we hear everywhere these days. My general assumption is that most things are in fact precedented. And so it's important to understand what was done in the past. And that usually is the first step of good research, doing a literature review, understanding what the company has archived, what the institutional memory is. And that's not just going to a central database. It's also communicating with people. And at a company as big as Facebook, a large chunk of what I do is just reaching out to other people and doing internal research, understanding who might be interested in a product, who's done work on it before, and gathering knowledge that way, not just in order to identify a gap in the literature, as it were, because not every single project that we do has to be entirely unique. You can, for example, verify past research, see if anything has changed, but ultimately the purpose is to set your research in relation to what others have done, and establishing those references, that context within your organization's research community is what makes other people, one, want to read it, and two, more impactful.
Yeah, great. And also just helps, with the team, right? It's
Totally
good for team dynamics. So, in your work, you said earlier that the ROI is not immediate, or at least the recognition of that ROI is certainly not immediate. So how do you, many of us like to see that, our work, that the output of our work turns into something. So how do you go about sort of just gauging your own value as a researcher, and understanding sort of how you're performing?
good question. When I worked in smaller organizations, especially in the consulting world, the impact was very clear. I would deliver a report to clients. They would express whether they were satisfied or dissatisfied. I would call them up in 6 months and ask, how has this impacted your team's strategy? Where are your sales right now? Where is the new product in the development pipeline? The risk of research at a larger organization is that our output might dissipate into the ether. And it is quite challenging to follow up and see the impacts. I think one way that you can evaluate impact is understanding the language that people use. Are people adopting terms that you proposed in your research?
Sure.
Even better, are people using frameworks that you proposed in your research? Good UX research, especially exploratory research, doesn't just make suggestions. We need, for example, a new product that accounts for privacy for children, that when children who are being photographed by their parents today in 10 years gave a sense of self, what are they going to do with it? Okay, that's a nice product recommendation. Good UX research also generates frameworks for helping people think through questions like privacy. How do we reconcile, for example, the gaps between attitudes and beliefs about people's social understanding of privacy versus what they personally want? And to answer your question, I think an indicator of success is whether others at the company, especially senior leadership of the company, are drawing on those frameworks when making decisions.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any thoughts on, obviously if they're using those frameworks, if you see your research is being used, that's a good way to maybe gauge your value. But do you also think that there's anything we can do to increase, our visibility as a brand, to, get more influence, to get a seat at the table, any way you want to frame it? Because sometimes, even though you still might produce some good findings, a framework, whatever it may be, that has legs and can be used, but it's not adopted. So what do you think we all can be doing to really improve our influence?
Super important question, because the reality is that at a lot of organizations, research plays a peripheral role within the structure of the organization. And so in order to increase our influence, I think that we shift away from a model that is so driven by pain points. I think a lot of people, especially at tech organizations, see research as a bunch of naysayers. Users have this problem. How do we solve for this problem? Your new product creates so much friction and disappointment. How do we solve for that? Of course, we need to address users' pain points. But engineers aren't very excited to hear about how their new product just frustrates people, especially when those engineers think that they have such a brilliant and novel idea. So it's much like when giving criticism generally. Any good manager knows this. You've got to package criticism with support as well. You've got to pad it with what people are doing well and not just how they're screwing up. And so I think as researchers, it's important to balance our recommendations for solving pain points alongside highlights of what a product is doing already well, and using those two in tandem to show how product specifications can be better emphasized to solve for user pain points, to bring to light, as I was suggesting earlier, latent behaviors, workarounds, aspects of users' interactions with our products that are going really well and that the organization might not have been aware of before. So in short, I'm suggesting that one way for user research to have a more impactful seat at the table is to also bring good news.
And it's something we oftentimes forget, right? And it's sort of 101 really in terms of just human dynamics.
Totally. No, nobody wants you just to be a naysayer the whole time.
Sure. And so on that point, and to maybe kind of connect it back, to your degree of history and anthropology of science, one of the things that we, that's not where I have focused. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a tendency in the sort of engineering space, if you will, and I, come from an IT background, to really focus on the solution as like the sort of the means. It's almost the end goal in and of itself a lot of times. Like the sort of how we do something is sort of super important for many in that space. Of course, not all. Whereas we're often kind of bringing in the why. So do you see both in your studies of science as a discipline and in your work, like a focus on solutionism, and how might you bringing in the why something, the reason why something is happening, maybe help combat that a little? And does that change the dynamic in the way you get people to adopt the insights and findings?
Yeah. I'm just thinking through an answer right here. The solutions versus answers to why questions. I think that one way of looking at this is that at tech companies, people generally, engineers in particular, researchers too, oftentimes think that this is the only app or piece of tech that users use. And so just getting your colleagues to see what people are doing on Google, on YouTube, on Wikipedia, wherever else, I think is a really meaningful contextual insight that researchers can provide. Just getting your colleagues to take the blinders off, as it were, to see more than just the water for the fish. A lot of my research is comparative in that sense, spending time with users on Facebook, on Instagram, but then on other interfaces where data are exchanged. Of course, online, such as Amazon and Google, but those aren't the only places where people exchange data. We give our address and phone number, for example, at the grocery store when getting loyalty benefits, or when going to hospitals in order to get personalized medical care, when going to a bank, for example. And so helping people realize that practices oftentimes thought to be particular to your own organization are in fact widespread. That comparative understanding, I think, can help researchers get others to see why the why answers work alongside the solutions.
Great. Thanks for that. And the comparativeness is, it's one of our value adds, so it's always worth reminding. And again, one of the reasons that anthropology is really great for this role. And so for anybody who, maybe wants to use their sort of multiple sort of perspective and comparative skills and really transition into this field, Is there anything that you would recommend? Anything specific, any upskilling, anything specific about a resume or a portfolio, anything that you've learned along the way that you think others should know?
Great question. We already talked about the value of chatting with as many people as possible, doing informational interviews. When it comes to people like myself and the clients whom I consult moving from academia to industry, I generally don't believe that more schooling is needed. Unfortunately, so many academic advisors could only suggest more schooling because that is the atmosphere in which they breathe. Degrees, courses, more education. I think that plenty of academics should think of the work that they've already done as UX projects. For example, plenty of academics have designed syllabi, have taught courses over a semester, maybe a year long, have iterated on their teaching methods, on their evaluation methods, whether it's the length and number of essays that they assign or their choice to include tests as well, maybe the media that have been included in the class beyond texts to also video or whatever other artifacts. There's a lot of product design that goes into creating a good course in the academic world, and I would encourage those who are considering transitioning out of it to reflect on their own teaching experience as if it were a product and their research on making that course better as UX research. I think it's similarly the case for our academic output. When writing a dissertation, for example, there are multiple stakeholders that one has to satisfy. One's immediate committee. One also has to speak to your broader discipline. And then when applying for academic jobs, you might speak to people who have zero interest in your domain. As a historian of scientists, I was oftentimes pitching my work to sociologists, to scholars of Egyptology, perhaps. We're always translating our work. Doing so for the sake of a corporate job is just one step further in that translation process, a process that I'm suggesting is a lot like what we do in UX research. And so that's why I think that a lot of academics in anthropology and other humanities and social science disciplines have the skill sets already. They just need to reflect on and use the language to make those skill sets understood by peers in the business world.
Yeah, great advice, very practical. It's really all about reframing it. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the projects. And I really like the syllabus example. It's funny, I was on as a guest on a teaching podcast a few days ago, and I actually suggested, iterating on your syllabi as a recommendation, treating it like a UX project. So funny to hear you say that today. So great. I think that's perfect. And, in terms of reframing experience, obviously you help with that. So do you want to maybe, again, mention, your website and where people could find you and, some of the services that you offer and anything else you wish to maybe bring up?
Absolutely. I do offer career transition consulting services. You can check it out on my website, larrysmcgrath.com. We'll talk about, for example, what opportunities are out there depending on your discipline. I cater, as you can tell from this podcast so far, to people from the humanities and social sciences, help create a portfolio, a LinkedIn page that gets people to dwell for longer, and then to package your work into a lexicon that is understood and persuasive for other people. I've helped a number of clients get jobs at organizations like Lowe's, Bressler Group, plenty of research and consulting institutions. I have a lot of fun doing it.
Great. Well, Larry, thanks for that. Anything else? Any other projects? Anything outside of that you're interested in that you think is worth bringing up?
I think that it's really important for academics to test their value beyond the academic world. I think right now, with the pandemic and the elimination of a lot of academic jobs out there, people are being forced to go into the business world in order to see what's out there as an alternative. I want to encourage people to see that as an opportunity as well. And I see there as being, I have a bit of a political mission to help humanities and social science doctorate holders to realize their value outside of the academic world, so that when we're all vaccinated and life is better, that academic institutions can no longer justify the meager wages given to their instructors, as well as the wage stagnation that we encounter right now on the tenure track. And there are a number of structural dimensions that need to be addressed, but at an individual level, I think that academics have the power to demonstrate that their value is much greater in the business world. And if there's a smaller pool ultimately of desperate instructors who are willing to agree to the meager salaries that colleges and universities offer, well, then it's going to be a whole lot harder for them to offer those salaries. And so that's my mission in doing this.
Very cool. Good mission. Thanks for the work you're doing. And thanks for coming on today. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thanks. Take care.